Hello and welcome to today's AP4D Symposium on Australia and Timor-Leste, Shaping a Shared Future. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler and I'm the Executive Director of AP4D, the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. I'm broadcasting today from the land of the Anawan people in the High Country in New South Wales and pay my respects to elders past and present. Particularly when we're talking about Northern Australia, we have to remember the many, many centuries of contact between our neighbours and First Nations peoples, and what a resource that is for us in our relationships in the Asian region. So thank you so much for coming today. We are delighted that more than 90 people had registered to come or listen later online as they need. And we're pleased that you reflect exactly the breadth that we're looking for, from defence, diplomacy, development, trade, international engagement, broadcasting, law, and lots of other things that don't start with D. What we're going to do today in the symposium is I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction to AP4D and the process that led to this paper. We'll then give you the main ideas in the paper, and particularly I'm delighted to welcome 3 of our working group members who met multiple times to pull together this information, and we'll be introducing them to you and you can get a chance to ask questions. Finally, we're delighted to have as a special guest Mr. Luke Gosling, OAM MP, who's the member for Solomon and someone who has a strong personal background and interest in Timor-Leste. So the Q&A is enabled. So at any point, if you find something interesting, please do put something in the Q&A. And the webinar is also being live captioned. So you'll see in the chat the link for that. And if you'd like to use the live captioning, please follow that. So as I said, I thought I would start by just quickly introducing AP4D and who we are. And I'll just check, is my screen sharing okay? I can get a nod from our participants. Perfect. I am not sure that worked. I do apologise. I'll make sure I get it right before I kick off. Okay, is that coming through a little bit better? Great. Okay, so for AP4D, we've only been going 18 months, but you may know some of the people involved, whether it's our wonderful, wonderful staff who somehow do all of this work and make it look easy, or if it's some of our advisory group, who are the people who got behind the idea of AP4D and who've been supporting us and helping us and guiding our development over these 18 months. AP4D is an initiative that brings together people from across the different sectors, the Ds and the things that don't start with D, to maximise Australia's influence. The idea being that in a difficult and complex world, we need all the elements of statecraft working together. So we're very much a platform for collaboration. We bring together people and pool, synthesize those ideas into options papers, which can then be shared with policymakers and more broadly across society. And so far, funded by the Australian Civil Military Centre, we have produced 11 papers. Today is going to make a dozen, which focus very much on Australia and the region, on Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and some of the issues that go across them. Certainly from my perspective, I felt that having done great papers on the Pacific and great papers on Southeast Asia, there was that little gap that we hadn't very specifically talked about Timor-Leste. And I'm delighted that we've been able to have this as one of the topics to look at this year. So the work we do is only possible because of the fantastic support of the Australian Civil Military Centre. I particularly like to thank the current director, Nicola Rosenblum, the previous director, Angela Fitzsimon. I'd like to thank Wayne Snell, who's about to speak, and also particularly to thank Jules Frost, who is an ACMC and ACFID staff member and who worked on the working group for this paper. So if I can, I'm going to hand over to Wayne Snell just to say a little bit about what the ACMC is and why it supports AP4D.
Afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much, Melissa. It's nice to get the opportunity to speak to a group of colleagues with a shared interest in some of these matters that sometimes we find it difficult to get it onto the agenda around the shop, but I'm just left a meeting this morning where I was quite buoyed. I was actually able to use a little bit of AP4D work to open a door and get a view onto the table. So that's a positive. But I digress. For those of you who haven't had anything to do with ACMC, ACMC is the Australian Civil Military Centre. It's a little centre inside Defence. We sit out at Queanbeyan, outside of major defence infrastructure, primarily because our role and responsibility is to try and get some coherence and some preparedness of Australian government agencies, including our humanitarian agencies and organisations, and defence better prepared to respond to and recover from conflict and disasters. That's primarily what we do. Part of that remit then is that we have capability development, knowledge development, exercising development, training, that sort of stuff, but also the ability to advocate some of the things potentially into environments where Defence's voice is an interesting voice because of its primary mission. So we get the opportunity to provide one little group to provide some alternative views and that sort of stuff. Very unusual, but quite fun, to be honest, to be working in this environment. AP4D to us is actually one of our flagship activities, primarily because it meets the primary objective of the centre, the mission of the centre. And when the centre was founded in 2008, the idea was for this type of work in the knowledge generation and sharing space. So this was part of that sort of vision when you read those original papers. The other thing about AP4D is that it actually brings together all of the different sectors into one place for very focused conversations, as you can see from this particular document, and also focused conversations where a whole range of other activities and other threads of thought, would be the term I would use, fall out, that actually help us to inform where some of the other rocks we need to turn over, some of the other places where we need to look and develop. So that's where we are at the moment. We've been in partnership with the AP4D consortium, for want of a better word, for some time, since its inception, basically. And at this point, we see ourselves being around for some time to come. So thanks very much, Melissa, and I commend this work to you. I actually really like this one.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's hard, isn't it? Because we're not allowed to have favourites. We love every single one of our working,
That's right.
our options paper, but this is an excellent one. This is an excellent one. Okay, so what I'll do now is just tell you a little bit more about what's in the paper. Okay, so the paper we're launching is the culmination of 6 months of consultations. Whenever AP4D works on a paper, there's, I suppose, a bit of a narrowing process. We start off with broad research and diagnostics, move into a dialogue, and then a smaller working group will meet multiple times in order to pull a paper together. We were delighted that the original dialogue, we had Hector, who you're about to meet in a moment, and Her Excellency Ms. Agnes Maria Almeida, who's the Ambassador of Timor-Leste in Canberra. And I can see actually on the line, a number of people who joined us for that first dialogue have come again today to see the results. So thank you for coming again. We then had a smaller group of people who worked together. They met 5 different times over the course and looked at multiple drafts, gave their feedback, gave more feedback until we got to something that we were broadly happy with. What was really special about the process this time is that we were able to work with the Asia Foundation in Timor-Leste, and I'll call on the country director, Hector Salazar-Salame, to just tell us a little bit more about the process that he went through.
Thanks so much, Melissa. I really appreciate the opportunity and the time. Indeed, as Melissa mentioned, we had the incredible opportunity to work with AP4D and bring together a group of 24 civil society organizations here in Timor-Leste, representing a cross-section of sectors as well as levels of work. They all have worked or work in all 14 municipalities of the country. And again, at different levels. Some are national level organizations, some are organizations that work very much in particular communities or municipalities. And the intention here was to obtain their views and their ideas regarding the challenges facing Timor-Leste but also framing it around the ideas of what does it mean to be a prosperous country in their view. And then from there, where are the areas where development partners can be of support to Timor-Leste now and moving forward. So in this slide, you'll see a summary and also in the report of what participants felt define a prosperous and developed country. Access to basic services is a key issue and topic that came up numerous times during the focus group discussion. That includes education, health, efficient infrastructure, accessibility, and so forth. No person is left behind, and inclusive development was a second very critical point that was brought up across the entire discussion that we had with our civil society organizations participating in the focus group. This is not just about the rights of people to have, say, for example, clean water and quality education, but also working towards and against all forms of discrimination based on sex, religion, sexual orientation, and zero tolerance in particular for gender-based violence, which is one of the most critical issues that faces Timor-Leste today. Quality education came up as a very specific issue and was highlighted very often by the participants of the focus group, as well as security and justice, where they felt that the transparency of the justice sector and system needed to increase in its ability to meet the needs of the population. And overall, as well, strong institutions and good governance are essential for any prosperous and developed country. Overall, I would say, and I'm very humbled again by this opportunity to be able to present some of these results on behalf of these incredible organizations that came together. The sense from the group is that Timor-Leste already has a very strong institutional framework, from its constitution to the declarations that it has ratified internationally. It has the frameworks in place to be an inclusive and prosperous country. However, it's the implementation of these commitments and these frameworks that still requires engagement and support. Here we asked in the focus group, the participants had an opportunity to highlight in the areas of the strategic development plan that the government has currently in place through 2030, within those categories, to identify particular topics or areas where they felt development partners could continue to support. Now, what we've done here and what you see reflected in the report and on this slide, we gave everybody stickers, hearts and stars. Hearts to signify areas where they felt more investment or greater priority needed to be placed, and stars where they felt that progress was already being made. Now, to be clear, as you look at this, it doesn't mean that because there are stars on a column that everything is fine and nothing else is needed. This is all about, it's a relativistic measure. So in terms of all the priorities that are required for Timor-Leste to become a prosperous country and continue down that path, where are the priorities and what things need to be emphasized. And here you can see, for example, that service delivery is a key issue that came up very frequently. Education, training, health, social inclusion, and environment, for example, were key areas where the focus group really felt that there was more investment and support that could be brought to bear by development partners. Infrastructure, sanitation were also very critical areas that were highlighted by the participants of the focus group, as well as rural development and agriculture in the economic development sectors. Justice and security were also key areas where the focus group participants felt that more attention needed to continue to be paid in these sectors. Now, what we can see here, and I think to summarize what we're overall, is there's a real emphasis on the human capital development side, the social services that are required to provide the ability for human capital to evolve in the country further. Something that came up significantly over the course of the focus group and quite unanimously, that there should be more opportunities for education, both in Timor-Leste, but also that there are opportunities for development partners to provide those educational opportunities through scholarships and study abroad. However, when we get to labor mobility, which is something we'll talk about later, there is this concern of brain drain, and that there is an importance for development partners to be supporting the development of the economy in Timor-Leste and not working towards simply mobilizing Timorese outside of Timor. And that message was very clear and very, very strong from the group. And in terms of governance, as you can see here, issues of implementation of policies and programs. There was concerns raised in terms of when political transitions happen, programs and policies, get erased and start all over again. That's something that is important to continue to keep an eye on and to keep an eye on, as well as just the government functions. And this is the last point that I'll make, because I think it's very related to how we development partners and Australia support. We have to keep in mind that as we're building the support and capacity of government institutions as partners, which is critical, every time, for example, that we send a public functionary to a training abroad, that's one less government official that's in the country doing the work of the people. And so that's something that also came out quite a lot within this focus group was the more that we have public officials heading out for trainings or skills development, it's work that's not necessarily getting done day to day in the country. And that's something that was highlighted significantly and important for us to consider as we'll talk about ASEAN and other issues and the demands on government as they continue to increase and how we balance both of those things.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking us through that. In terms of what we did with that information, we took together those that really, to me, valuable and really unusual chance to be able to hear pretty much directly from Timorese civil society organisations, thanks to the Asia Foundation, with the consultations we did with both Australian and Timorese experts. And what we put that into is the usual AP4D way. We give a vision. We say, what does it look like for Australia to shape a shared future with Timor-Leste? So in the paper, we explain why it matters. I imagine no one on the call needs to know that, but there are people out there who do need to know. We talk about what are some of the barriers and challenges. We talk about what we heard from the Australian side, from the Timorese side, and then the big focus is on the vision and pathways. So I'll just outline those very quickly for you. So in terms of the overall vision, it's very much one that looks at mutuality, respect, and shared leadership. We had a big focus on that political will, the mobilising the Australian society that care about Timor-Leste to overcome the barriers and challenges that Timor-Leste faces. So we talked about shared interest, about Australia making sure it's a trusted and reliable partner, using Australia's expertise to support the local and national priorities, and obviously focusing on locally led and accountable initiatives. As you heard from Hector, there was a strong sense of strengthening institutions and how Australia can do that. And very importantly, that we see Timor-Leste as important in its own right, not as part of some geopolitical play. Finally, and very much in an AP4D theme, we looked at just how many elements of statecraft are involved in this and suggested that we need a lot more, investment and coordination across those arms of statecraft so that they're appropriately respected and resourced. Now, for each of the papers we do, we include a lot of existing examples for a number of reasons. One, just to tell people what's happening. Sometimes these, and am I looking at any department in particular? No, sometimes all Australian government departments don't communicate what they're doing very well. Also, we feel that where things have been working well, you can look at that and say, oh, maybe we could invest in that a bit more. Maybe we could expand it a little bit. So I think there's even more than this, just as these are just the ones I could fit on a slide. But these are some of the case studies that you'll find in the paper describing what we're already doing in terms of being a partner for a shared future. And then, because we do have to add something new in any paper, we suggest, I think that is 8 pathways. Yes, I think my counting is good enough. We suggest 8 pathways where Australia should particularly focus. These aren't exclusive. We always see there are many, many pathways to try to get to the same destination, but these are some examples of the things that we suggest. And for each of them, we have some specific recommendations of things that could be done. So I don't want you to just read that. I want you to hear about it. And so what we've arranged is we have 3 of the working group members who've worked on this paper who are going to be here. We're going to have an in-conversation with them. I'll have some questions for them first, and then I strongly encourage you in the audience to please make sure you put your questions in Q&A. So I know these are not the only working group members here. So can I just take this moment to give a big shout out to every one of the working group members who are involved. Please do use the Q&A function to communicate with us, particularly if the questions get too hard for us. So can I welcome onto the virtual stage, Philippa Venning, who is the Vice President, Program Quality and Strategy at ABT Associates. Thank you, Philippa. We have Parker Novak, who's the non-resident fellow in the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council, and is joining us very late from DC. And can I get to turn, you've already met Hector Salazar-Salame from the Asia Foundation in Timor-Leste. Okay, I'm just seeing if I can see everyone's screens. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. Hector, I think I'll start with you. And it's a hard question. Can you tell us, honestly, what does Australia get wrong and what does it get right in its relationship with Timor-Leste?
Thanks, Melissa. I thought this might come a little bit later. But I'll give it my go. Look, I think as reflected in this paper, and I think everybody that's joining us is well aware, the relationship between Timor-Leste and Australia has had its ups and downs. It has not been a linear trajectory towards the partnership that it has today. And I think I wanted to highlight that as well as reflected in the paper, for all the partnership and the relationship building that can take place, one or two small or big issues can derail a lot of work that's been done. To quote something that I recently read, friendships take minutes to make, moments to break, and years to repair. And I think that encompasses in some ways the relationship and the trajectory of the relationship of Australia over the last 3-4 decades. I think that the relationship between Timor-Leste and Australia today is probably the strongest that it has been, and especially with the assertions during the COVID period and afterwards in terms of the importance of the relationship, both for Australia and Timor-Leste. And I think that it's building off of this respect, this trust that is being earned by both parties and growing over time. It's ensuring that we and Australia and Timor-Leste continue to build upon it, avoid situations where there are particular issues, small, medium, or big, that could derail this critical partnership for the region. I think Australia has exemplified both through its programming as well as its discourse that it's an invested partner with Timor-Leste. Even if you look at many of the programs that you just highlighted on screen, Australia tends to take a long-term view in the areas in which it's supporting the government and Timor-Leste overall. Generally the period that we have ahead of ourselves in Timor-Leste is a dynamic one, and it's going to be ever shifting. From the economic to the political to the social, it's going to be significant changes. Being able to keep that close collaboration and that communication and that dialogue taking place is going to be one of the most critical aspects moving forward. It would be an error either on Timor-Leste or Australia's side to stop or not maintain that ongoing dialogue. And I think that's why this paper and this work is so critical. And to me, it's a starting point for more dialogues and conversations that need to happen. The last thing that I'll say is that it's the relationship between the Australian government and Timorese government, but it's also about the Vox Populi and the people as well, and maintaining an understanding of what is happening on the ground by both parties and incorporating that into the thinking.
Well, I might go to Philippa on that. So Philippa was Australia's Deputy Ambassador in Dili, and I'm interested in how you characterise the relationship. I mean, Hector's giving us a sense it's not a straightforward relationship.
Sure. I mean, Hector made some really good points there and pretty much covered the waterfront. But I think I've been in and out of Timor sort of over 15 years, but when I was actually posted there, it was 2018. So that was just when the Maritime Boundary Treaty was agreed. So it was a very positive part of the relationship, sort of culminating in the treaty coming into force in 2019. There was the big anniversary of the vote at 20 years. So we had Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister from Australia visiting, which had been the first, well, there hadn't been many high-level visits up until then. So it was a very, very positive time, which sort of opened up a lot of other doors in the relationship. And then, of course, COVID hit, which was a very challenging time for Timor-Leste, but it was also an opportunity, I think, for Australia to really step up in health in particular, around vaccines, etc. So I think, there's definitely been ups and downs, but it's very much on a positive trajectory. But I would say that history of of long engagement means there's a lot of people with a very deep passion for Timor-Leste, both within government and outside of government. A lot of people working in Dili now or elsewhere in Timor-Leste are, were there during Interfet, or, they've been in and out. So there's a real passion. And I think nobody takes the relationship for granted. And people, I think a lot of people from the Australian side think, well, given that background, people have to really work hard to earn that trust, and it's never taken for granted. And I think that is, that sort of respect for Timorese sovereignty, is a great basis for the relationship, and is a good platform for the future.
Well, I might get you to continue a bit just in terms of that people-to-people side, that this is it just isn't government to government. So tell me a bit more about that. What's your experience been of why it's so important?
Yeah, I mean, of all the countries that I've worked in, I think Timor-Leste has that strongest people-to-people sort of anchor, which is, a wonderful ballast to have in any bilateral relationship. And of course, people-to-people is not just non-government relationships. Government's still made up of people. So, that passion that I mentioned before really does help steer the bilateral relationship as well. But those sort of those relationships, like those friendship groups, for example, that have been working in Timor-Leste for decades and often working at, local level, so in various municipalities to an Australian local government, they've been working for a long time, have incredible relationships. And again, it's really where that trust is embodied. And I think, the more recent examples around labour mobility, and yes, Hector made the point that there's a real concern about sort of brain drain, but at the same time, most people will want to return to Timor-Leste, and they do. So again, that's, really building those sort of relationships in areas beyond the traditional sort of development areas and more in the economic areas. So I think there's a huge strength there, but it also feeds into the government side as well.
Okay, well, I might go to Parker now, and I'm just going to remind everyone in the audience, please do put the things you want to talk about in the Q&A. So I thought, Parker, I might move on to some of the pathways in the report. And in fact, the first pathway suggested is about supporting Timor-Leste as a candidate for ASEAN membership. So is this something that, Timorese politicians are very focused on?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And it's a really important issue to look at, especially this year as the country seeks to attain full membership in ASEAN. From my point of view, this has certainly been a priority for senior Timorese policymakers since they regained independence in 2002. I think, you certainly see it amongst elected officials and political leaders, particularly President Ramos Horta, who has been very focused on foreign affairs during his first year or so as president so far. And I think he really sees securing ASEAN membership successfully as a way he can leave a legacy for his country. And that's part of why he's prioritized it so much. And I also think, you see it in the civil service as well. I guess since folks already know this, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does have an ASEAN secretariat within it, and they've dedicated substantive institutional resources to it. And I think the Timorese government is certainly very focused on securing full membership this year while Indonesia is the chair of ASEAN. And, they've been a formal candidate now for 12 years or so, give or take, and they were admitted as an in-principle member in late 2022. And I think a lot of folks in Timor see this as the year to take that final step. We'll see if that actually happens. Mr. Horta had a quote mid last year, was in a state visit to Indonesia, where he effectively said that getting into heaven is easier than getting into ASEAN, talking about just how difficult the country's process had been. I remember when I lived in Dili for a couple of years, it just seemed like an endless stream of ASEAN study tours over at Timor Plaza, where you would see the cars, all the little flags. So yeah, it's certainly been a long process for Timor, but I also think, from what I can tell you, they seem bullish on their prospects as they go into the year. We'll see what the rest of the year holds.
Mm. Look, I might stay with you for a moment, Parker. I mean, one of the other recommendations is about supporting Timor-Leste's democratic processes and institutions, and Hector's data showed that very clearly. Now, I'm conscious we're in the midst of a Timorese election campaign. So talk a bit more about what role there is for external partners in a task like this.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, partially because, this is an issue really near and dear to me, because when I lived in the country, I worked on democracy and governance development. So I certainly have my own biases here. But, I think what really has struck me about democracy in the country and governance as well is just how invested your average Timorese citizen is really invested in that democracy. We all know that, how they came to earn that democracy. It came at a very steep price in 1999. And I think that's part of why you see that investment from Timorese in that democracy, is because it ultimately helped deliver independence, but that came at a cost. And as we've all looked at the country in the last 20 or so years, the development of its democracy, it certainly has not been linear by any means, but nonetheless, since 2002, come to today, they've built a democracy I think they can be really proud of. You see the Economist Intelligence Unit's annual democracy rankings consistently ranking it as one of the most democratic, if not the most democratic country in Southeast Asia, which I think when we zoom out and look at global issues, as we talk about a decline in democracy, a rise in autocracy, that's an important story to tell. And I think gives Timor a very unique position on the world stage. And I do think it's important to note that that development of its democracy has been supported by the international community over the years, mainly in capacity building in regards to institutions, leadership development, things of that nature. And again, I've worked on some of those programs in the past, and I do think the international community can continue to play a role, particularly in regards to strengthening institutions and looking at political parties, empowering women and youth, and looking at political representation for those groups. Subnational governance, I think, is a big area as well. And going back to what you just asked about ASEAN, assuming Timor ascends to full membership, is looking at the sheer number of technical requirements, the number of meetings that are going to need to be attended every year, and all of these things that go into that, that's going to be a ton of work for the Timorese government. And we all know they face, because of the scale of the country, they do face some human resource constraints. Yeah, that's an area I think the international community can be quite productive and seemingly is already well down that path, which is a good thing. I do think as we look at governance, kind of tie that all in a bow, it is important for the international community to play a background role and really keep the Timorese at the forefront of it.
Absolutely. Well, we've started talking a little bit about the economic diversification and just what an important priority that is for Timorese. So I might go to you, Hector. You're talking a little bit about the issues around what economic diversification and how Australia can support that, and issues around labour mobility. And the way the paper puts it is very much labour mobility as a transitional step. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Melissa, I think it's one of the most complex topics in any country when we're talking about labor markets and economic prosperity and opportunity. I mean, ultimately, what it comes down to for any economy is that you need to have a strong supply of human capital. And at the same time, you need to have a strong supply of opportunities. If these are not in equilibrium, then you are not optimizing what is possible in terms of growth and prosperity for the country. At the moment, Timor-Leste has an incredible supply of labor. Its population, it's a youth bulge at the moment, very young population. Human capital is evolving and growing, yet the supply of opportunities are still incredibly limited in the country. And the human capital that does exist still requires further skilling and evolution to meet the requirements of the existing both country economy, but the world economy. We have to keep in mind that we've transitioned as the globe into Industry 4.0. It's about technology, it's about digital services, it's about the Internet of Things. Now, Timor is a bit behind, right? It doesn't have that internet connectivity permeation that many other countries do, but it's coming, right? And we can talk a little bit about that later. That will
one of the
shift things.
pathways is very much around digital transformation and what that can mean in people's lives.
And this will start to shift many things, right? On the economic front, it's about, well, okay, where's Timor-Leste today, and how can it potentially leapfrog some of the other phases of the industrial revolutions that perhaps other parts of the world have seen. But now that requires, as I mentioned, a supply of human capital. When we think of human capital, we often simply, or not simply, but often comes to mind as education, health, and those foundational aspects. Those are critical. But then beyond that, as working adults or young adults, you need to continue being able to upskill, and your human capital development comes from workforce skilling up. And those opportunities need to be matched up with what's happening in a particular economy and the opportunities that are taking shape. And that also includes being able to experience what's being done in other countries, the ways that other countries have evolved or are managing particular sectors. So when we talk about labor mobility, there's in many ways a really high importance for people to be able to head out of Timor-Leste, go to Australia, go to Indonesia, go to other countries and experience and work in those sectors, with the idea that they do return back and are able to reintegrate those skills and those concepts and ideas into the Timorese economy. So ultimately, as Brett Inder, who's here on the call today, recently said at a seminar with two of his co-authors, is that, you know, we know from the economic theory that the more supply of highly skilled people you have, ultimately that will lead also to higher skilled and higher productivity sectors. But that's only part of the story. You also need the enabling environment by government to support private sector development, to support ways in which, for example, as we were talking about ASEAN, just entering ASEAN doesn't wave a magic wand that will create economic benefits for the entire country. There's a regulatory and enabling environment that needs to be in place for private sector to really take advantage of the opportunities that may come with ASEAN ascension. So all these pieces need to come together. And the last point on labor mobility, so yes, having those skills and abilities to obtain that, whether it's vocational training in country, vocational training outside of the country, higher skill development in other countries, all very critical. When we talk about exiting the country, I just want to highlight the point again that the community, the civil society organizations highlighted, and that's that concern about brain drain. And Philippa brought it up very well and said, but that's not the intention, that's not what's happening. But I think it brings us back to the first question you asked me, which is we have to understand the perceptions, because that's the perceptions of civil society and perhaps, you know, the general population that it is a brain drain, even though it may not actually be, and that's not the intention. So it's also about communicating what these opportunities are and the intentions of that, bringing those skills back to Timor.
Got it. And I think you've responded very well on this, but we do have a question from Melquiano Salgado Maria, which is really about, you know, Timorese students who get scholarships to Australia, who say all the things they're going to do when they get home, and does anyone make sure they do it? Philippa, I'm guessing the Australian government can't enforce that, but can you answer that one and then go on and tell us a bit more about the education and health aspects of the paper?
Sure. I mean, I think those scholarships, while there are not a huge number of them, they can be really, really important, sort of as a targeted sort of tool to help, you know, a small number of people. So I think there is certainly no restrictions on what people do when they go back to Timor-Leste, but there's a lot of evidence that people who have done those scholarships have ended up in very significant positions. And I think the embassy would make a big effort to bring those people together and do, you know, sort of support their careers when they do return back to Timor-Leste. Sorry, you go, Melissa.
Yeah, no, in terms of, you know, education and health in the paper, that's clearly one of the key areas for human capital.
Yeah, and it was interesting that the paper, you know, said it was incredibly important, but progress hadn't been made in those areas. And obviously, Australia's been working in health and education for a very long time in Timor-Leste. And that's because of the clear links to social and economic development, of course. But the statistics do remain challenging. There's been, you know, a fair bit of progress in maternal and child health, I think, but perhaps in education, it's been a bit more patchy. And I think COVID, we're starting to get some evidence that COVID has sent education outcomes backwards, including in Timor-Leste. And I think even where the statistics improve, sometimes for people, it's not very apparent. And I think that sort of inequity that remains is still a huge issue. So, you know, particularly for women, people living with disabilities and other groups are not seeing those improvements. So, I think it's going to remain a priority, I'm sure, for Australia and other donors. I mean, USAID is also a big donor in health in Timor-Leste, working on health systems, as is Australia. Of course, there's other donors in education, and Portugal has been sort of traditionally quite involved. Australia is very much, I think, focusing on teacher quality and school leadership, so quite sort of discrete aspects. So I think it would definitely remain a priority, but that sort of intersectionality, or how those issues work with others, and I think climate's the big one. There's going to be a lot more challenges in health, both in terms of the burden of disease, in terms of agriculture and food security, that Australia will be really well placed to help support Timor-Leste through. So there's lots of, I think, opportunity there, but a lot to do.
Absolutely. And I note we have a comment from Anonymous, who said that, one of the things you need to create is this expectation that you travel and work to Australia, but, you all come back and contribute to society. So I think that's a good point. Now, I've got 3 questions. I've got 3 questions. So I'm going to try and do one each, and then we're going to go to our special guest. So our first question is around the fishery side. So Keith Twyford has just worked with us on an excellent paper on illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, which we would love you all to read. Asked about what sort of possibilities there are in the fishery sector for Australia. Would anyone like to come in on that one?
I'll give it a go. I thought you'd jump in there, Hector. I guess there's sort of 2 parts where I'd imagine, there'd be immediate opportunities, and one is around sort of maritime domain awareness and the work with the Defence Force, the Australian Defence Force, in helping Timor-Leste surveil its own waters. But then there's also the economic opportunities for legal fishing, and how that gets sort of produced and sort of bringing a new economic opportunity to Timor-Leste, including for the export market. And I think it's been on Australia's agenda for a long time. And, of course, there's the illegal fishing to deal with immediately as well.
Thank you. Well, the next question is from Judy Atwood, which is around onshore processing of Timor's oil and gas. Would that lead to much employment of Timorese? Who'd like to come in on that?
I'll take that one also. I think the short answer is no, not at the level that's required to absorb the excess labor in the country. So if you think about the oil refinery industry, don't quote me on this, I'm just simply making up a number, but say that you're able to create 1,000 jobs, and maybe because of the agglomeration effects and the multiplier effects, you're able to create, say, 10,000. But when you have 35,000 or so odd youth coming into the labor market every year, that's only one very small piece of the puzzle. So if the country at the moment is estimates are that it's creating about 2,500 private sector jobs a year, and again, you have over 30,000 people coming into the labor market every year, it's an exponential problem that's been growing. And the oil and gas industry, through refineries, platforms, et cetera, is not going to, again, magic wand solve this problem. We need to be looking at sectors that are able to absorb high amounts of labor. And at this time, in the short to medium run, really that's agriculture is a key area. Over time, tourism could evolve into one, although of course we know that has a lot of dependencies in regard to the demand for that product as well. So it's one of these things we have to work on the supply and demand at the same time on something like tourism. But short answer is no.
Not enough. Okay, and our last one, and Parker, you only have a minute on this, is Timorese attitudes towards international resources companies and what is being looked for in a good foreign investor. Feel free to answer more broadly on foreign investment as you like.
Yeah, I think whilst attitudes on the oil and gas issue, they're not monolithic, I think they're broadly characterized by nationalism and wrapping in the flag mentality that has become quite politicized over the years. That's something we've talked for a long time about. As I think the Timorese government and others may view foreign investors, I think or what may make that more amenable, I think the top criteria is trust. Maybe answer that.
That's what we're looking for. Well, this has been such a pleasure, and I don't want to stop and I don't want to let them go. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to put in the chat one message they'd like people to take away from the paper. Okay. I didn't tell you I was going to give you a typing task, but there it is, small typing task. What I have to do now is I have to turn to our very special guest. So we are delighted that Mr. Luke Gosling, OAM MP, the member for Solomon, has very kindly recorded a message today to share his thoughts. He is someone who has a long history from both the defence and the development perspectives on Timor-Leste, and we really wanted his views on how he responds to this paper as somebody in our nation's parliament. So over to Mr. Gosling.
Thanks very much, Melissa, and g'day to everyone tuning in to what is a subject very close to my heart, and that's our relationship with Timor-Leste. My name's Luke Gosling. I'm the Federal Member of Parliament representing Darwin, the capital of the North, and I've been involved with Timor-Leste for a bit over 20 years now. And very relevant to this initiative is that it's been in sort of track 2 diplomacy type work, in development work, and in defence with the ADF, working with the Timor-Leste Defence Force. So hopefully I can share a couple of perspectives from the last 20 years. And they've been working in Timor-Leste as a filmmaker, as starting and running a charity, doing maternal health, water and sanitation projects, building schools up in the mountains, and working on capacity building and some other roles, working in the Office of the President, and working as a member of the Australian Defence Force, working with the FFDTL, the Timor-Leste Defence Force. And I've certainly learned more off them, I think, than I was supposed to be advising, but I learned a great deal during that period about the resilience and the wonderful hearts of the Timorese people. And for those listening, I'm sure if you've been to Timor, you've experienced that yourself. So, yeah, some perspectives. I mean, I think it's really important and great that the paper's focusing on how Australia and Timor-Leste can build a shared future together. Now, I was part of a defence cooperation team, and that's why I learned so much from the FFDTL, as I mentioned. But also in that development piece, I learned a lot about the importance of capacity building, but doing it together in a shared vision, and certainly using our resources to build up the capacity of the Timorese NGOs that we partnered with, whether it be in construction, building the education facilities in some of the mountain areas, providing some drinking water to villages, or indeed the maternal health work. And I think that's been one success in Timor-Leste, is that we've improved the rate of maternal health so that less Timorese babies are dying before they even get to 1 year of age. And in terms of foreign policy, and there's a lot that we can be proud of with our relationship with Timor-Leste, but there's also a lot that we can't be proud of. And certainly as a member of the Australian government, I'm proud to be part of a team that has Timor-Leste's best interests at heart, that moved the former government to a position where we made sure that the median line issue and the resource sharing was sorted out. And I'm a big advocate within federal Labor, the Australian government, for Timor, but I'm far from alone. There's many supporters of Timor-Leste and people who understand community development, who understand capacity building and respect for our friends in Timor. And that mutuality and respect is vital to any relationship. And hopefully those that have tuned in have seen that with the Prime Minister Penny Wong, Pat Conroy, who's actually up here in Darwin with me today, that really going into the Pacific and into Asia and engaging in an open, transparent way, acknowledging our friends and partners in the region, not just as part of some geostrategic struggle of the great powers and our role in that, but as a proud independent country that wants to have great, genuine partnerships with countries, our friends and partners in the region. And you can be assured, those watching, that you've got a good partner with our government. This is not a political pitch, but it's hopefully you will see that as the budget comes about, that the importance of diplomacy, the importance of development, sustainable development and partnered development will be obvious. I think our focus on our relationship with Timor-Leste must be about helping Timor-Leste build their institutions. They'll have another election series next month, and of course whatever government the people of Timor-Leste choose, we've got to continue to work with them, with civil society and businesses. We from Darwin here, it's a short flight to Timor, and we often have business delegations going over, seeing where we can work together. We've got flights going from Darwin, as many of you would know. But importantly, what we are doing in Timor, and I learned this over a couple of decades of working in Timor, is if projects are locally led, that's going to be more successful. The outcomes are going to be better, but it's also going to strengthen institutions, whether they be, as I said, civil society, and importantly, government institutions. Timor-Leste has had a very difficult future, a very difficult past, but there's no reason why they can't have an incredibly bright and prosperous future. But it's going to take continued partnership and focus on helping them realize the different opportunities that they have to provide for their people. And Australia will continue, certainly with our government, to do everything we possibly can. I think it's important that that respect that I mentioned. Some people only see Timor-Leste through that big powers contest and through the prism of, we need to do something there. Otherwise someone else might come and do something, and what is sometimes said or sometimes unsaid, is they're, referring to China. Well, as far as our government's concerned, we need to engage with our partners in the region in a genuine way and value them in their own right as sovereign independent countries. The Timorese people fought hard for their independence, and we assisted them at the end of that journey and continue to assist them to this day. And I think we can be proud of nearly everything that we've done since. But as I said before, not everything, and we need to make sure going forward that we continue to be making decisions on how Australian taxpayers' resources are spent with the knowledge and the expertise that the Timorese people themselves have in determining what they want. And you only need to look at our government's view on the voice. Having an ability for First Nations people in our nation, in Australia, to have an organised way of getting advice to the Parliament, to the ministers, like the Defence Minister, like the Foreign Minister, like the Minister for International Development, about the future. Now, just some quick perspectives, and I'll let you go. It requires all arms of statecraft to have a robust, long-term, positive, enabling relationship. And that's what we're committed to with Timor-Leste. I've seen it work well on the ground. One quick example, when I was with the Defence Cooperation Program over in Timor-Leste, is that I talked with the commander of the Timorese military unit that I was working with about things that they wanted to do and the community's expectation of them, and it was around disaster management. So together we organised an activity that simulated a disaster event, earthquake and tsunami type activity over on Aotearoa Island, and we deployed over there and fanned out across the island, beautiful island of Aotearoa, in order to check on the welfare of the people there. So it had real-time benefits because the FFDTL were working cooperatively with the police, getting out into the community, seeing how the welfare of the people was in reality on the ground, but simulating that sort of disaster experience. And when we got back to Dili on the boats, there was just cheering through the streets of Dili for recognising the professionalism and the work that the FFDTL, the Timorese military, in cooperation with the police, were doing for the nation. And it was an example about how good defence cooperation can be done, where the priorities of the partner, in this case the Timorese government and the Timorese military, bonded with our own ability to organise and provide resources, support, advice to get a great outcome. And there's so many more examples across development, international development, and capacity building, building those institutions and being a good neighbour, a good friend, as the Timorese people were to us back in World War II, but they remain very close friends of ours, one of our closest neighbours. And I just really encourage all that haven't been there to get over to Timor-Leste, visit, and if you're working in any way, to just remember those key principles of locally led engagement, valuing them and their experience, and respecting that and working cooperatively together. It's been great just to spend a small amount of time with you this morning. Those principles that I've just outlined as relevant, working in defence cooperation, working capacity building on the ground through development activities, and obviously in our diplomacy. Hopefully our government, the federal Labor government, will continue to show leadership in this area, and you'll see that, and also give international development and diplomacy its rightful emphasis through the budget process and through our work in the region. Thanks a lot. It was great to come and have a yarn, and hope to do it again. Cheers.
And huge thanks to Mr. Gosling for joining us from Darwin to share that message. I love that he is promoting Timor's tourism industry. We should all listen to him. But I also love that as one of Australia's parliamentarians, he can tell us about what resonated for him in the paper. And it sounds like there was so much from this AP4D options paper that really resonated with his understanding. So all that's left for me is really just to give thanks all of our speakers today. And we really appreciate you dialing in from near and far and from early and late. It is much appreciated. I'd like to thank to everyone who got us to this point. So our advisory group, the working group members who met over and over again to work through this process. I thank our editors. I thank our AP4D team that makes this look easy. And I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today for your attendance and for your questions. What we hope is that we can stay in touch. So please do sign up for our newsletters or follow us on social media so that when we have our next interesting paper, our next interesting process, if it's something that you'd like to join in on, that you also get involved. So thank you again for joining us today. And it is a delight to declare this paper launched.